Welcome to MangaCafts, the place where I bring your favorite anime worlds to life, from legendary locations to iconic buildings. If it exists in anime, I'll find a way to recreate it. And today, I'm tackling an absolute classic. Daiden's hideout from Mount Corvo. This rugged, weathered cabin, hidden deep in the mountains near Fuchsia Village, is where Luffy, Ace, and Sabo grew up. With its patched-up walls and barely holding together roof, it perfectly reflects the rough lifestyle of the mountain bandits. Stick around to see how I brought this piece of One Piece history to life, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps. Alright, let's start bringing this hideout to life. It's made up of three key parts. The entrance, a simple but sturdy front section. The main hall, the heart of the hideout, a large rectangular structure. And the watchtower cabin, a small cabin on the roof, topped with a wooden watchtower. To kick things off, I cut out all the walls from wooden cardboard sheets. Once I had all the pieces, I removed the window openings and glued the walls together on a base for stability. Next up, the roof structure. Since the roof needs to support the watchtower, I start by creating a solid framework to hold everything in place. Then, I add vertical supports to ensure the roof tiles are positioned neatly and aligned properly. This roof has a unique design. The sloped sections curve slightly inward before meeting a flat surface at the top. To get this right, I first fix the flat part, then add the supports to guide the inward sloping sections. Once everything is in place, I move on to assembling the entrance roof support and putting together the cabin and its roof. Now, using a few pieces of thin wood that I straightened earlier, I actually got these from cheese packaging. I cut them into 0.3 centimeters wide slats to create a realistic wooden plank wall texture. I glue these slats onto all the hideout's walls. Next, I place a smooth piece over the roof slope, covering the entire surface. This element serves as a base to help position the roof tiles correctly and keep them aligned. I repeat the process for the entrance, carefully cutting the supports to match the exact slope of the main hall. Before gluing the roof tiles, I cover the flat surface of the roof with thin wood slats for added detail. Then, I attach all the roof tiles section by section until the entire roof is covered. I'm using different sizes of tiles in various shapes: squares, rectangles, trapezoids. This way, I can stay true to the Mountain Bandits' building style. They use whatever they have on hand to create a roof that serves its purpose, no matter how it looks. That rough, improvised style fits perfectly with the Mountain Bandit gang. Next, I focus on the windows. I use wooden toothpicks for the frames, cutting each piece to the same diameter. My goal here is to make them look like logs. These wooden pieces will form the framework and separate the windows. The frames are long and narrow, so I can create multiple windows within each frame. If you're enjoying the process so far, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more diorama tips and tricks. I repeat this process for the entrance windows, ensuring the X shape remains in each one, staying true to the original design. Alright, let's add more details to our mountain hideout. I start by placing circular beams around the house, aligning them with those at the entrance and main hall for a cohesive look. Then, I glue the large wooden pillars at each corner. These elements are supposed to be structural, but here do not support anything. I also add similar pillars at the entrance to maintain visual consistency. Next, it's time to build the door. I begin by crafting the door frame with toothpicks. I carefully assembling each side for a precise fit. The door itself is made by gluing thin wooden slats onto a wood cardboard base, giving it a rough, hand-built appearance. Above it, I add a small overhanging roof, angled slightly downward and supported by two wooden pillars. To finalize the house's structure, I add the last roofing element. This piece covers the gap between the two sloped roof sections, completing the silhouette of the hideout. Now, it's time to build the watchtower on top of the hideout. I start by constructing the framework using skewer sticks, forming an X-shaped structure. I first assemble two sides, gluing them together before repeating the process to complete the last two faces. Next, I secure the floor and add the barricade elements. The barricade consists of two parts. The first is a half wall made from wooden slats. giving the tower a rugged hand-built appearance. The second part is a small railing composed of 2 horizontal beams held in place by several vertical posts, reinforcing the rough, improvised look of the structure. This tiny railing is one of the smallest elements I need to make here. I cut the pieces from the same thin wood I used for the wooden planks and slats. To complete the watchtower, I add the final essential element, the wooden ladder, providing access to the lookout point at the top of this mountain refuge. Now our bandit's hideout is ready to move on to the painting step. But before jumping into that, I'll first create some decorative elements that will be painted in the same color as the hideout. The idea is to prepare everything that will have a wooden texture, so I can paint everything in one go. Let's start with tiny wooden boxers, one of the most common decorative elements found almost everywhere. I begin by pre-cutting all the thin wood slats that will make up the boxers. To assemble them easily, I first glue each face of the box onto a slightly rigid piece of paper. This step ensures that all the faces are straight and uniform. Once the first box is cut and assembled, I add some details to make it look more realistic. On each side, I create a small wooden frame to give it more depth and structure. Then, I add a diagonal wooden beam, reinforcing the authentic look of the box. For one of them, I'll leave it open. This small detail adds life to the scene, bringing a sense of movement to an otherwise static environment. We finally reached the painting step. This time, I wanted to try something new, painting with coffee. I saw a video of someone staining wooden sticks with coffee, and the results were amazing, so I had to give it a shot. I love this method because it's faster than acrylic paint and gives a surprisingly realistic finish. However, I ran into an issue. The coffee doesn't adhere to glued areas, leaving blank spots where I attached the beams. To fix this, I had to match the coffee stain using acrylic paint. It took several attempts to get the right shade, but in the end, the transition is almost seamless. With all the wooden elements painted, it's time to move on to the roof. A simple red base with some white highlights will do the trick. I make sure to paint each tiny section that makes up the roof tiles. For a realistic lighting effect, I lightly brush the surface of the tiles with a worn-out brush to create small, irregular white lines. If I need to adjust the highlights, or if I go too heavy on them, I can simply brush over with the base color to tone things down. Once that's done, I can focus on the windows. For the glass, I use a thin transparent sheet, carefully placing it inside each opening. To dress up the windows, I'll add blue curtains. To achieve the right look, I take a light thin fabric and dye it with watercolor. First, I wet the entire surface to help the color spread evenly. Then I apply different shades of blue to create subtle lighting effects for a more realistic result. If you just learned a new way to make miniatures, hit that like button and turn on the bell. It really makes my day. I also prepare a second piece of fabric with colorful watercolor accents, which will come in handy for additional details later. Once the fabric is dry, I cut and glue all the curtains in place. Now the hideout is really starting to take shape. Let's add the final details to our entrance. I cut 2 sword shapes from wooden sticks and paint them in gray tones. To give them an aged look, I apply a diluted black wash, then use a wet brush to gently remove some of the black layer. This allows the darker color to settle into the small grooves, creating a weathered, time-worn effect. Next, I paint the upper decorative element. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I'm staying true to the original manga design. Once everything is painted, I glue all the pieces in place. I also add the door handles on each side, made from aluminum wire. The door itself is mounted on small nails at the top and bottom, allowing it to pivot open and close, a small detail I really love in miniatures. Finally, I complete the entrance by attaching the small roof above the door. One last element before wrapping up the hideout and moving on to the landscape, the Daydan Bandit's flag flying at the top of the house. I paint the emblem onto a white fabric, cut it to shape, and attach it to its pole. I glue the watchtower onto its support. Then I attach the whole structure to its designated spot on the roof. Daydan's hideout is nestled deep in the mountains, surrounded by rugged wilderness. The landscape features uneven terrain, scattered rocks, tangled roots, and thick bushes. The perfect hideaway for a band of outlaws. To replicate this untamed environment, I added lush greenery, winding roots, and weathered tree trunks, making sure every element felt as natural and immersive as possible. The goal was to create a raw, organic look, capturing the wild, hidden essence of the mountain bandit's refuge. I cut the base from foam, marking the house's placement's position and the natural slope of the terrain. Using a precision cutting tool, I carve out the elevation changes, shaping the land to feel rugged yet natural. Once the general shape is set, I refine the surface with sandpaper for smooth transitions. To define the road, I use a Dremel to carve out a height difference between the path and the rest of the terrain. I then level the road's surface, ensuring it blends seamlessly with the surrounding landscape for a realistic, cohesive look. To refine the terrain, I use polymer clay to fill in any gaps or damage from the shaping process. I also sculpt and smooth the ground, giving it a more organic, natural look. For the base color, I apply a light brown layer across the entire surface. Before it dries, I blend in darker brown shades, allowing the colors to mix naturally and create realistic earth tones. Once completely dry, I mix different shades of green flocking to achieve a varied, non-uniform grass texture. I then carefully sprinkle it over the designated areas, bringing the landscape to life. To texture the ground, I sprinkle a layer of fine sand over the surface, creating a natural, earthy look. Once set, I glue down small rocks and twigs, adding depth and realism to the terrain. These scattered elements help break the uniformity, making the ground feel more like a real, rugged mountain path. Now, let's bring some vegetation into this environment. For this, I'll be using jute rope, glue, and different shades of flocking to create realistic bushes. I start by cutting a small 4 to 5 centimeters piece of rope. Then, I carefully unravel 2/3 of it, leaving the last third intact to serve as the base. To keep everything firm, I apply glue to the loose fibers, making sure they stiffen as they dry. While waiting for the base to set, I prepare tiny twigs that will add volume to our bushes and trees later. To do this, I completely unwind another piece of rope and cut 0.1 to 0.2 centimeters fragments. These tiny fibers will serve as the fine branches within the bushes. Once the base is dry and rigid, I move on to flocking. I dilute glue with water and pour it into a spray bottle. Then, I lightly mist the bushes and sprinkle the tiny twigs over them. I repeat this process 2 to 3 times to build up volume, creating fuller, more natural-looking bushes. Next, I apply a layer of brown paint over all the bases, giving them a natural branch-like color. Once dry, it's time to flock the bushes. For this, I use 3 shades of green, a dark, a medium, and a light one. I start with the darkest shade as a base, gradually layering the medium tone and finishing with the lightest green. With each layer, I carefully sprinkle less flocking to maintain depth and ensure the darker tones remain visible underneath. To bring even more life to the scene, I add small patches of colored flocking at the very tips, creating the illusion of tiny flowers blooming within the foliage. The bushes are done. Now it's time for the largest vegetation in this diorama, the trees. I use thyme branches as the base, since they naturally point in the same direction. I reshape them by cutting and gluing some at different angles to create a more realistic tree-like volume. Next, I need to thicken the trunks, as they are way too thin for proper trees. To do this, I first wrap wire around the base, but you could also use aluminum foil, scotch tape, to bulk up the structure. Then, I coat the trunks with clay, smoothing out the surface and refining the shape. To add texture, I use a toothpick to carve various grooves and ridges, mimicking natural bark patterns. Once the clay is dry, I go back in with a precision cutting tool to add even finer details, enhancing the realism. Before painting, I clean up the trunks to remove any dust or residue. Then, I apply a base coat of white before carefully mixing a color that matches the original thyme branches. To finish, I add a highly diluted brown wash, using the same technique as on the swords. This final layer seeps into the grooves, darkening the recesses, adding depth, and giving the trees an aged, natural look. Alright, our trees are ready to be flocked using the same method as the bushes. I apply 3 shades of green flock, from darkest to lightest. Once done, I glue all the vegetation onto the landscape. With clay, I smooth the transition between the trunks and the ground, adding a few roots sinking into the soil. I paint over it to blend everything seamlessly, then refine the terrain with grass and twigs. To add variety, I create patches of static grass, forming subtle flower patterns that enrich the natural setting. For the final touch, I scatter leftover thyme branches across the ground, enhancing the wild, untamed look. With the landscape complete, it's time to fix the hideout in place, securing it with toothpicks for stability. With a fishing line stretched between the entrance and the front tree, I create a clothesline. I make sure to give it a natural curve when attaching it, simulating the weight of hanging clothes. Now, remember that colorful fabric from earlier? It's time to use it. I sketch out tiny clothing shapes, cut them out, and hang them on the line. With the clothesline in place, I will add the last few decorative elements to bring the hideout to life. Now everything is set. This miniature reproduction of the iconic place where Ace, Sabo, and Luffy grew up is finally complete. I hope you enjoyed this build as much as I did. If you got inspired, let me know in the comments. And of course, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next one. Now, enjoy the final showcase. And remember that what once was just a drawing is now right here, one of many brought to life, with so much more to come.